Salutations, welcome back. Today I would like to speak on an expression that I'm sure that we have heard many times. The expression is recorded in the Bible, and it is, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, but I'm going to share a few, the two preceding verses that go with it, just to help put it together. Now, I think it reads, let me read it, or try to just say it from memory. Where Paul is saying in verse 11, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 11, he's saying that I have learned to be content in all things, in every circumstance. Then in verse 12, he basically repeats the phrase to say that I have learned to be content with everything. And he says, I've learned the secret. In fact, he says, I've learned the secret to be content. And then comes verse 13, where he's saying that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, when we look at the three verses, just in a nutshell, verse number 11, he is saying, I am competent. Verse 12, he is saying, I am composed. And then verse 13 is saying, I can. But let me back down a little bit and go back to verse number 11, where he says, I have learned to be content. In other words, Paul is giving us the idea, saying that I have been in the institution of life. And in this college of life, I have learned. I've learned. Now, when we look at life, and we know that in life there are different phases that the same way we would have it in the education system, where you would have a primary primary school. There's another stage which is the secondary stage, and there's the tertiary level of education. Now Paul is saying, I've been in this institution of life. And in this institution of life, where I've gone through the different stages of life, I've experienced. In fact, in verse 11, where he's saying that I know what it is I have learned to be abased, and I've learned to be abound. In other words, I've learned about poverty, I've learned about prosperity. At one stage, I lacked everything, and at another stage, all my needs were met. So Paul is saying, in the school of life, I have learned about everything. I know what it is to be between these stages. I know the bittersweet of life. I know the bitter and the sweet, the sour and all the salty, the shades in between of life. I have experienced them. I've gone through this school of life. And in this institution of life, Paul is saying, I've done various subjects. I know I've done the subject of being abased. I've done the subject of abundance. I've done the subject, so I've been there. I've done it. And he's saying, you know what I majored in while I was going through and studying in the school of life? My major subject was competence. While my major subject was contentment. This is what he said, I've learned to be content with what I have. I've learned, irrespective of my circumstances, to be content. And that word there is used, and it basically means to be competent. I've learned that whatever may come to me, and in whichever life would hit me, even below the belt, I've learned to be content. And that's just an indication of the level of competence that he enjoyed. And Paul is saying, I've gone through it, I've learned, and I've went through it, and this is now I can look at it and say, I have learned to be content with everything. That's an amazing place to be, because as we go through life, sometimes you would find, and you may be at a place in your life that you feel like dropping out of the school of life. At a place where you feel like giving up on life. You look at your circumstances, maybe you at a level, the poverty level. Or maybe you at a level, or you have the abundance. But still there are some other challenges in the school of life. Maybe your situation is of such in your marriage, in your family. It could be that it is at your workplace or for some other reasons, but you're at a place where you are in the school of life and things have become difficult. Maybe it is a kind of a subject that you're dealing with right now, and it is a subject that is too hard for you. How often have we found that the children would drop out, students will drop out of school or drop out in varsity from their studies because there is some subject, there's a module that is too tough that they just cannot nail, and as a result of it, they drop out of their studies. Is it perhaps in your life that there's a tough situation? Something, and right now, as to this gender-based violence, maybe there's a woman out there who's looking at a situation and saying, this is so difficult, I'm going to drop out of this situation, I'm going to give up, I can't take it anymore. And somebody may be looking at it and say, I think suicide is an option. But you know, Paul is saying, I have learned, I've gone through the situations, I have experienced, and the main lesson that I learned in the school of life is to be content. That's what he has learned. And even with the contentment where he has learned to be competent, and it's people that are competent, that are able, that have gone through the school of life, that have got a different view of life, that looked at it in it, and they drew the lessons from it, and as a result, grew, developed, and reached a stage where they can say, I am content, I am competent. I've taken life is a school, but it's a school when we approach it in a proper fashion, that we can glean a lot from it that enable us to be competent and looking at the challenges of life and be able to face them. And Paul is saying, in fact, when we look at the passage, the context of it, he's talking about the sufferings, and in the entire book of Philippians, he's talking about the hardships, the sufferings that he had been through. I mean, this is a man who knew what it was. When he wrote this epistle to the Philippian church, he wrote it from a prison dungeon cell. He wrote it from unfavorable circumstances, and he wrote this, and he catered to and encourage the saints out there. And in fact, in chapter 4, verse 4, he would say that, rejoice in the Lord, rejoice. Imagine sitting in a dungeon cell, awaiting, trial, and you're sitting there, and you could encourage people that are out there and say, rejoice in the Lord, I say rejoice. Imagine going through these things. So they were in prison. He experienced his school of life was one that is nothing to boast or to brag about, because that's what he went through. But through it all, he said, I have learned. I've been in this institution of learning, and what I've learned, the lessons were to be content. That speaks about competence. That speaks about a proper perspective towards life, looking at life and saying, what is that I can glean from it? And the situation that you may find yourself in today is just for you and me to learn from it. If we can just grab the lesson, and from the situation, we will be rendered competent at the end of the day, competent to deal with the issues of life, competent to make the best of it, and the best will be brought out of us. And this is what Paul is saying. He says, I've learned. I decided not to drop out, to give up, give in. But I've decided to take the lesson. So I've learned. And so there we see the competence level of Paul in verse number 11. Then he continues in verse